My European name is Maurice Coles. My Islamic name is Irfan, given to me by my sheikh some 13 years ago, and I tend to trade under the name Maurice Irfan Coles. I'll talk about my education in a minute, but in terms of my upbringing, I'm a boy from South London. I'm originally a Brixton boy from a housing estate. And it was a pretty ordinary estate in those days. I was born in 1946, so the war had just finished, and etc. And they were quite difficult times in terms of deprivation. But what was very interesting, from a very, very early age, alhamdulillah, was given a great sense of God, of spirituality, right from, well, I can remember. There was always that bit of me which accepted the reality of God in whatever way you tend to define him, really. And so my childhood was relatively straightforward, privileged in the sense that in those days within London there was money, and I was able to go to the theatre and the opera house and all these cultural things which weren't part of my actual background, but because of the good schooling. I went to one of the first comprehensives, 2,200 pupils. And I always had a sense of drive and purpose and social justice. And as a young man, as a 15, 16-year-old boy, I used to go to Church of England of my own volition, which was quite unusual given the environment in which I lived. My mother was a strong Christian, and I thought my calling would be in the Church of England. And I often joke, that quite recently there was the most senior position, and I may have been up for it if I'd gone in the Church of England, but I lost the faith. Education background, pretty bog standard. Local primary school. Just trying to think whether it was even Church of England. I don't think it was. No, it wasn't. It was a secular, but in those days every school was a Church of England school in terms of its practice. Singing hymns. Quite strong RE, which obviously made an impact on me. Very strong on the ethical side of things. And then from there I went to Kingsdale, it's called, which later on in my life, when I was a Birmingham Inspector for Education, was on the national news as one of the worst 6 schools in inner London. It wasn't one of the worst when I was there, and not just because I was there, but it was when I went there, it was full of idealism and hope, because in those days, when we're talking about, you think about the timing, in 1957 I would have gone, and then left in, went to university in 63, 64, so, and people were saying, comprehensive education, this is, because prior to that we'd had the grammar schools and the secondary moderns and so on, and they were abolishing those, and then so I went into one of the first comprehensives in the country. And there was a lot of idealism, a lot of hope, a lot of drive. Academically, well, as an Ofsted inspector now, I'd be very, very critical. I'm very critical of the management, but I think that sense of idealism partly rubbed off. I was the only boy, the only child, really, young person, who got to university that year, so it gives you a notion of how academically it wasn't very good. But I think that partly reflected my own sense of personal drive and ambition to do something. Interestingly, I saw my future when I was about 15, 16 in the legal profession, because people always said I had the gift of the gab, right, which you may disagree with. When you've got 15 hours of footage, you'll see. But also, it comes back to this strong sense of moral purpose and wanting to do, and it sounds too noble, but wanting to do good, wanting to bring about change, wanting to make a better world, partly from the Christian part of me, I think, but also, I think, if you like, the secular part as well. But it wasn't Allah's plan for me to go into the law, because I really wanted to be a barrister, partly because people said, well, really, I wasn't rich enough or posh enough in those days, which is probably true, because it was very privileged. But when I had my careers interview, the chap said I wasn't bright enough, which was a bit of a shock to me, because I thought I was actually the most brightest man in the world when I was about 15, or child in the world. A year later, he changed his mind and said, but I destroyed that ambition. I went to university, Newcastle, and read history, which turned out to be extremely useful in terms of the ability to argue, the ability to reason, the ability to write, the ability to make a case. So it was very similar in terms of evidential basis. Read history, then thought I was going to go to Africa, and I thought I'd better do something. So I did a postgraduate certificate of education, PTC, for 1 year in London. Taught in the grammar school in Brixton, which was very close to home, and never planned to be a teacher. That was never part of my life plan at all. But I realised, alhamdulillah, that I seemed to have got some propensity for it, and I actually quite liked it. And so I spent some time in that school, and then I moved to the school where this masjid is, which is really interesting because there are 2 Islamic schools here. I was about less than 30, and I came to Kilburn High School for Boys, which was one of the worst schools in England, and I can say that from all my experience of being in thousands of schools. Very difficult, almost broke me. We then joined with the girls' school across the road, made it Bronsbury in Kilburn. I was head of English. I completely, with my team, changed the curriculum, made it multicultural, made it relevant to the needs of society. And we transformed the school from one of the worst into one of the best in the borough, interestingly enough. But then I thought, well, hang on a second. I was getting phone calls from all over the country about what have I done in terms of Pakistani heritage literature or African Caribbean or African. And so I decided to visit all the areas from whence the largest minority ethnic groups have come. So in 1977, I set out on my self-financed travels and spent 7 months in the Indian subcontinent, East Africa, Caribbean, researching and things. And then I came back to the school up the road here, you see. So in education terms, I kept almost like reinventing myself. And because of all the work I'd done in anti-racist stuff, I then finished up as an inspector in Birmingham looking at multicultural education. I was senior advisor. And what's happened, there's a pattern in my life where I keep recreating what I am, in a sense. And so you ask about learning and education, and it is. And the Prophet was the first lifelong learner, wasn't he, really? And then, although I didn't know much about the Prophet in those days, in retrospect, I can see how I almost modelled myself on that. My Lord increased me in my knowledge, and seek knowledge even unto China. And I've always had this thirst to understand everything and to relate to everybody, and that's one of God's great blessings to me, I think. I think probably the greatest and most positive influence in my life was my mother, who was not an intellectual, not a reflective person, not a person that could argue about Christ and whether or not he was the Son of God. That was never part of her thinking. She was just a very simple woman who automatically believed in God and the love of God, and Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and so on and so forth. And therefore, I grew up in that environment, a very loving environment from my mother. Excuse me, much of my ethic, I think I actually take from my mother. And I started to go to church of my own volition, which was very, very unusual. My father was very different. My father was very sceptical. He was bright, and he would argue. He thought all religions were mumbo jumbo and basically very dangerous. Very different from my mother in that sense. But sadly, for my father, he being a product of his own time, I think, one of 11. Father died in the Great Flu epidemic of 1920. Whatever it was, 23 or something, went into a home, very difficult, very poor upbringing, very, very poor upbringing. And that made him, as far as I was concerned, he didn't have a role model, because I think his father had died when he was 8. And so consequently, he was aloof, he was very distant. But he was also very hard-working. There was a real sense of drive and loyalty and dedication in what he did. And I think I inherited, in a sense, the loving stream, and then that, if you like, the academic as well as the industrious stream from my parents. So in Sufi views about choosing your own parents. It's almost like, I did it, if I could even say that, but because it does seem that the combination of those two, by God's grace, made me what I am. As a young man, I thought I just wanted to be a lawyer, a barrister, not a solicitor, because Allah gave me the gift of the gab and a relatively quick wit. But going to one of the first comprehensives in the country, expectations were very low. And also, the members of staff said that to be a barrister in those days, this is the sort of late 50s, you needed money. I came from a housing estate. Money wasn't there, period. I was also told I wasn't bright enough one year, and then I was bright enough the next year. In that intervening period, I decided I didn't want to be a barrister, as a young person. My self-esteem was a bit dented. And then I didn't know what to do, to be honest. But I think teaching chose me, because I thought, well, I'll do my education diploma in the Institute of Education in London. And because I was going to be a writer and a world changer, and one of these young idealistic boys in the 60s, full of I'm going to change the world, it's possible. I still believe that, by the way. And I started teaching, and I realised I'd got some propensity for it. I enjoyed it, and the young people seemed to enjoy me. I'm the head of English in the school. Then I had a range of jobs until I joined the Birmingham Education Inspectorate as a senior inspector for multicultural education, because that was my real passion. It was multicultural matters. It was social change. It just fitted all the bills, really. And then since then I don't teach children so much, although I do work with young people, but I don't know how many thousands of in-services I've done with teachers and others. So, it sounds a bit of a cop-out, but I think it was God-given. Because if you look at my background, as my own daughters, who are 29 and 30, say, we can't work out how you finished up from where you started. Because I was just an ordinary boy, really. But I think God just gave me this sense of social justice and of supporting the oppressed. It sounds a bit noble, this. I don't mean it to sound that way. But it was just there. It was there almost from birth. And okay, it was reinforced by my reading of the Gospels and the vicars that I met, and then the school, obviously, in terms of. But it was a period anyway, where in the 60s, where we were changing everything, and you really did believe that you could alter the world for the better. And I've never lost that, although I'm now 67. That's still a central core of my being. I wouldn't continue to be so committed and do all this writing and stuff I do, really. But when I go back, there's no... Because my sister, who's sadly dead, but she had none of that. We were so totally different. So I have to fall back upon, well, actually, I think there was a divine purpose. I wouldn't have said that sort of 20 years ago, but I think from my present position, I think there was a divine purpose. And, Allah guides to him whom Allah will, but you've got to want to be guided. When I left the country in 1977, that's when I did the big period of travelling, I'd met Muslims in the UK, but the mass immigration was just starting. And I don't think I would have particularly distinguished a Muslim from a Hindu from a Sikh, although I understood something of the difference in terms of their faith background and their canons of belief. So I don't know that I went with any great expectation. But going to Pakistan, and less so to Bangladesh, because it wasn't quite so acute there, I came across Muslim hypocrisy big time, because people thought I was an MP, you see, because you don't, in 1977 in Pakistan, you got, I travelled up country, I was in Mirpur and places where you don't get white people, you don't get what, it was called a Gora, this white person, and because there'd been a delegation, and so people were lobbying me in the street to try and get their cousin, brother, sister, dog, cat into the UK, you see. And I met I mixed with a number of quite senior immigration officers as well, and their view was very negative. And I understood why people would lie to get their children and their family over, because it's a better life. I mean, there's no two ways about it. But I found the lying bit quite difficult. So, and I remember I was in a village in Mirpur district, and I didn't think I was going to come out alive, because the chap that was taking me was the education officer, and he was a very pompous, opinionated chap, and he said to me, "Why wasn't I a Muslim?" Very aggressively. And I said, "Well, if I'd have been in Mirpur, born here, I probably would." I said, "And if you'd have been born in London, in my background, you would have probably been a Christian." It's quite a difficult question to answer in some sense, because it's actually, I do go back to the thing about Allah guides to him whom Allah will, because I'd certainly no intention of ever becoming a Muslim. But if you start with, as I was blessed with a strong spiritual sense, right? And Muslims always like it when I say this, that I saw my future in the Church of England, but I lost the faith because I couldn't believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ, interestingly. And that was a matter of faith. I couldn't accept him as a prophet. And this is long before I had any reading at all about Islam. Also, as it happens, by marriage, I'm a caste Hindu, because I married my long-suffering wife some 34 odd years ago, and I had all the ceremonies related to Hindu priests and all the rest of it, and chanted in Sanskrit. And I'm very much at home in terms of being in a Hindu temple, in a mandir, or any of the South Asian religions. But it was never enough. And when you have that search, it's there, and it doesn't ever go away. There are a couple of seminal moments, really. When I started in Birmingham in 1982, I was a school advisor to 20 schools in what is a predominantly Muslim area of the city, Allen Rock. And I met for 5 minutes maybe a man called Sufi Mahmood. Right? I never forgot him, ever. And what it was his eyes shining in prayer with the love of Allah. And although I wouldn't have used those terms, there was just something deeply, deeply spiritual about him. And so I met him for 5 minutes. Then I had a number of experiences reading the poetry of Rumi and realising that it just resonated, as if I'd read it before. And I studied history, English history. So it didn't fit. But a lot of the words, a lot of the passages, I just thought, hey, I've read this previously. About 15, 16 years after meeting Sufi Mahmood, I wasn't promoted in a way that I thought I would be in the education service. And so I thought, God is giving me a message here, and the message is I've got to do something that's far more spiritual, directly spiritual. And I decided to seek out Sufi Mahmood, and I'd only seen him for these few minutes. And he runs one of the most run-down masjids you could find anywhere in England, I think, really. It really is pretty run-down. And I went to see him, and he decided in 2 weeks that I could do the Shahada. He gave me the name, because he said, you know God with your heart. And it was Irfan Allahi, so my Muslim name is Irfan Allahi. I had no intention of... I went really to see him so I could have some more structured zikr. That's what I went for. And it just never occurred to me that I might finish up, as I say, inside the tent. And so that was it. And then, lo and behold, there I was, Maurice Coles. Not a script that I could ever have imagined I would write, to be honest. As you know, it's not a long and complex ceremony, and I was also, at the same time, you're inducted into the Naqshbandi Tariqa, which is obviously a sheikh, and you become a sheikh. He'd been promoted by then to Sheikh Rashid. And there was him and I and one of the sons as witness. And it was all over in several minutes, really. I'd done the Shahada, and that's it. Lo and behold, off you go, Sonny Jim. You're now one of us. And that was the abiding memory. There were no sort of blinding lights and heavenly trumpets. It was very low key. Well, like a lot of reverts, the response one got was very varied, and I mean very different. So, for example, in terms of my immediate family, my two daughters, who at the time would have been, I think when it was about 13 years ago, so they would have been 16, 17. The younger one, who is the more spiritual, I believe, said, "Dad, I'm really proud of you because you've taken, a principled decision." The elder one said, "It's your soul, Dad. You make your own choices." Right? My wife was very hostile, and she was hostile because she thought that the Hindu community of which I was a member, obviously, her community, would be very, very anti. I only lost one friend who was one of my closest friends, but when he lived in Hastings, and I wrote to him, and he responded with a diatribe and said it was a detested religion, although he still respected me. He didn't want to see me ever again, because this was a hateful thing. Blah, blah, blah. And to be fair, he divorced the faith from me, but he still didn't want to see me. So I said, well, so be it. No sleep was lost. And then it took my wife a while to accept the fact. And she never will be. She's not particularly religious, but she'll never be particularly comfortable with it, I don't think. My mother, who was then very old, I never told, not because I was keeping it from her, but because by then she was at the very end of her life. But I think she would have been very cool about it. I don't think it would have worried her, because she'd always said, well, you're always a bit odd. That would probably have been her comment. No, my mother, you're always a bit weird. So, and my in-laws, I think my mother-in-law, who was very spiritual, I think she would have understood, not on an intellectual level, but on a spirit. And my father-in-law, because I became quite successful in all sorts of ways, and knew the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury. My father-in-law was really pleased at that side of things, so he was quite happy to tell everybody in the community. And because I've actually done quite a lot in terms of trying to bring Hinduism and Islam together as an intellectual canon of thought, I mean, I think that's made a difference. But yes, and my life has changed, because what Allah's allowed me to do is a lot of writing, a lot of public talking in relation to education and Islam, a lot of analysis, and to bring all the skills that I think I had of all my years as a senior education officer and all the stuff I'd done in race and faith equality into the Islamic fold, really. So, and of course, it's the first time in many years since I was a child that I actually feel spiritually totally at home. And all those years of wandering in the sort of proverbial wilderness, you are still wandering. And when I do my prayers, then I know I'm in the right place, as it were, and that there has been some divine guidance which has got me here. And I'm still as committed and as driven as I've ever been in relation to change. Okay, it's altered a little bit. I now run this charity which which is dedicated to compassion in education. And would I have done that if I hadn't become a revert? I don't know. You can't. It's a big if question, but I doubt it. And what the lovely thing for me is that all I believe has been reinforced by the moral compass and the spiritual compass that I believe is the heart of our faith. Really, it further reinforced my resolve to, in education terms, to make us as Muslims look at ourselves very closely. There are signs for those that reflect, only reflect, only reflect. And what I think the Islamic world's not done very well over the last century is actually reflect. And I was involved with a number of groups who were trying to prepare materials that countered the very negative stereotype that on the one hand, in relation to the level of Islamophobia, but also on the other hand, to try and get in my perception, an accurate view of what Islam is. Right? And that led me into all sorts of other avenues. So, for example, finally, you can trace a line there that my major piece of writing is called Every Muslim Child Matters. which was based upon a then government policy of every child matters. It didn't come out until 2006. So, and it was 7/7 rather than 9/11, which really began to spark it even more. Because the two coalesced. They really, one was British inspired, and the other one was more American orientated. And I think for us in the UK, 7/7, we realised that we could grow our own terrorists. They didn't just come from Saudi. They came from Leeds, which is a lot more uncomfortable for people. And I think a lot of my work, therefore, especially with young people, was almost like going back to basics and saying, well, what is Islam? What are the fundamental tenets of our faith? What does it mean? What does taqwa mean? How do we live our faith? And again, it's almost as if Allah put me in a position to be able to ask some of these basic questions. And that's one advantage about being a revert, because I've got all sorts of other cultural baggage, of course I have, because I'm born and brought up in a society, as it were. But I don't have a lot of, if you like, the subcontinental or the Iranian or Iraqi or whatever. It doesn't really matter, but everybody comes with some cultural baggage when it comes to that sort of stuff. And I didn't have any relation to Islam, and that made a huge difference. Because the Sheikh my Sheikh always says, that I see things with my heart, and that's the essence of, I would think, spirituality and indeed Sufism. It's looking at things, and it starts here and then moves here, as it were. Whereas I think quite a lot of the practices that have evolved over time with adherents of our faith have started here and have forgotten this, really. Well, I think on one level it's very straightforward that all the work, I've done every Muslim Child Matters, where what we did, and I say we because I don't do anything alone. One thing I've learnt over time is that it is better when you've got strong allies, and so all my material, all my Islamic writing, everybody pores over it, and I want scholars in particular to say, well, that's rubbish, and where have you got this from, and I'm very, very happy to accept those criticisms. So that's one thing, and I wouldn't have written that if I hadn't reverted, obviously. But also, and again, it's another privilege, for 3 years I was the director of the Islam and Citizenship Education Project, and that was as a direct result of 7/7. Government financed, but community-led, community-driven. And what we did, in essence, and now it's a worldwide movement, really, we produced 44 lessons, 22 for Key Stage 2 and 22 for Key Stage 3. And essentially we took all the values of citizenship from the national curriculum and we Islamicised them. And not surprisingly, we found that actually there was almost a perfect correlation between Islamic values and citizenship values. There are one or two issues, but basically, and I was able, again, it's such a privilege, I was able to put together an advisory group which consisted of all the major fiqh, both Sunni and Shia, and it was a fascinating project with doing these lessons. And they were approved by everybody, finally. And that, alhamdulillah, that was no mean feat, because, there's a lot of tensions within our various communities. And obviously that wouldn't have, I couldn't have done that. And it's partly because I'd done some research in madrasas. And then subsequently, I've been working with a number of groups, both Shia and Sunni, interestingly enough, on trying to devise a common curriculum for madrasas, because they're just so varied, So the ICE project, which actually went into independent Muslim schools and then into mainstream schools, was another thing. And I've done a lot of work with Muslims and parents, and obviously I wouldn't have done that if it hadn't been for the fact that I was a revert. Yeah, that's another very good question, because I have done several khutbahs, which is really rather nice in various places. And I did one in Nottingham in Ramadan a couple of years ago with a friend of mine who asked me, because I happened to be there working on the ICE project. And I was talking about the nature of masjids and how unfriendly they could be. And I may always joke anyway that because I tend to be there and I've got three-piece suit on and look like the sort of pucker Englishman, that they're not friendly places. So you go in there, and and I speak to everybody because I'm just a jolly chap, really, And there's first of all, there's a suspicion. I always joke and say, well, actually, I think I'm MI5. And I say, well, actually, I'm MI6, to be honest. But, so, and that breaks the ice a bit. But one of my favourite stories is, and wherever I go in the world, I pray. Right? And I travel a lot, all right? But the most friendly place I've ever been in terms of masjid was in Washington, Boston. And I was there doing some work about education and school improvement. And on the Friday, I was in the Hilton. I said to the concierge, I wanted to go to one of the masjids, and I said, I walk over if I can. And he said, okay, Maurice. He said, he went to the web, and he downloaded this thing. And so the posh bit of town was that end, and he said, oh, it's about 2 miles down here. And he sent me, and it got more and more run down, and blacker and blacker in terms of clientele. So I thought, I wonder if he sent me to the Nation of Islam, because they still see white people as devils. Of course, that'll be interesting when I go want to pray next to the Nation of Islam. But it wasn't. It was even more run down than my own masjid, and that's pretty run down. And I walked into the front door, and there was a black American guy, and the welcome I got was the best I've ever had. Hey, alhamdulillah, come in, and all this sort of stuff. Right? And I know Americans are very good at sort of being friendly. And I tell that story because if I go into English masjids, you don't get that welcome. There's a sense initially of, I don't know, it may be cultural. It's certainly suspicion. And I've been into lots and lots of different masjids. I make a point of going to different masjids, see what sort of response I get, really, to be honest. It's like some bit of action research. My feelings with the communities, the one I'm closest to, because of Sheikh Rashid, the Kashmiri Pakistani, and it took them quite a long time really to acknowledge me, because I'm a bit of a sore thumb. One, I'm relatively prosperous, and it's a very, very poor community. But now I'm a bit of a sort of figure, as it were, and I'm extremely close to the Sheikh, and which is lovely for me. When I travelled, and outside the American experience, the place I felt most at home in is Qom. When I was in Iran some 4 or 5 years ago, and I travelled with a wonderful man called Farouk Mullah, who is a Deobandi scholar, and it really opened his eyes. Because in Qom, in the university there, you can study Hinduism, you can study anything. It's an interfaith, really. Now, as he said, if you go to Mecca, Medina and study, they wouldn't be studying Hinduism, they'd be burning the books, really. And you arrive in a place, and okay, with some of the they're wonderful masjids, that non-Muslims are not allowed there. But of course, as soon as they found I was a Reba, alhamdulillah, and then I become in you go, And again, it was like me reverting. You actually feel very much at home. So, but often I go to places, and I pray and I connect with God, inshallah. But I don't feel that they're waiting with open arms to say, "Oh, jolly good," I don't get stoned, but when I did some in-service in the school earlier this morning, I was making this point that it's almost as if Allah keeps bringing me back to this area, right? Because I taught in the schools. I left in '76, and then when I came back from my big world trip, I taught in the school up the road, so I was still very close to this. And when I was here, the local authority purchased what was the synagogue, and it became the school hall. Right? And when I left at the very end of 1976, the school said goodbye to me here in this building. And I'd heard it had become a masjid, but I knew nothing about it. But running the ICE project, Yusuf Al-Khoi, who was one of the advisory board, said, "Why don't we have one of our meetings here?" Right? And Chevening Road, and I knew Chevening Road, but I didn't actually automatically paint a picture of it. When I arrived, of course, and I came to the Al-Khoi Foundation, and I saw, we came into this building do salat. I mean, it was a mystical moment for me, because I just stood here and I thought, alhamdulillah, how lucky can a chap be, that this is because I've still got in my house at home, when the authority took all the seats out, there was a lectern, and the guy that did it from the synagogue gave me the lectern. So on my desk in my office at home, I have a lectern from the synagogue. So, and it's very strange. So every time I come here, I just think, mashallah, what a privilege, what a privilege. And now, of course, it's the buildings that were the schools in which I taught are now both, they were Islamic schools. So, and I was here on Sunday for a Sufi event in the Interfaith Centre, so it's very strange. In a sense, one can't second guess what God's got planned for one, but it's very interesting how, and I'm very at home here, very at home. The charity is quite fascinating, because you see, as people say, I've got one of the most varied profiles in education. So, and I was 18 years as a senior officer, advisor, and inspector in Birmingham. And so I've been responsible for school improvement, for anti-racism, for faith equality. It's a whole range of things I've actually done. I've also done a huge amount of writing on a number of issues. And it was just over a year ago, when I decided that I've been very lucky, because I had my pension from the West Midlands, but then because I ran a private company, I had a pension from that as well. So I decided that because Allah had been so good to me, that I'd take part of the lump sum and I'd use it to form a charity, right, which would be, I don't like to about my legacy, it sounds awfully so egocentric, but I wanted to record somewhere a lot of the stuff I'd done, because so much of it is web-based, there was a bit here, and it's actually trying to bring it all together. And originally I was going to call it Promoting International Community Cohesion. It was the PIC Foundation. People said, "Oh, wait a minute, this government doesn't like community cohesion, so you won't get any funding." So I thought, okay, fair enough. So I dropped that title, and then I thought it was quite funny for a Muslim. And my second title was Karaf, right? And it was the charity for the advancement of race and faith equality, because they're my two big drivers, really. People say, "Oh, wait a minute, and if you can put faith in it, then a lot of funders don't like the term faith." So, and then I know what it is about. It's about cohesion and equality and diversity, co-ed, right? And so it became the Co-Ed Foundation. But in discussion, and I'm very lucky, I've got some very, very high-powered people who are on my advisory board, and a lot of really high-powered patrons. No money, but there's a lot of intellectual capital there. And they were challenging me really about what it was really about, because they're saying, and one of them said, and it was quite nice, he said, "Look, Maurice wants to change the world, and that's really good, but we've got to ground him. This charity can't be called Let's Change the World charity." And one of my colleagues, who happens to be a Muslim, Rahana, she kept saying, "What's it about? What's it about?" And in the end, I said, "Actually, it's about compassion in education." And so I'd already got the co-ed title, so it was almost God-given that it fitted. And I mean, essentially, it's just beginning really, and we're just about to get our charity number, and we have a sort of 3-year strategic plan and a website. All this is now it's going to happen, and it is about bringing in a lot of my existing writing, but it's also about a lot of new stuff. So the major piece of work which I'm doing with Professor Mick Waters and Professor David Woods is called Towards the Compassionate School, and essentially that's a book which takes spiritual, moral, social and cultural education, takes the whole, it says, well, what would a compassionate school look like? What would a compassionate pupil look like? What would a compassionate teacher look like? What would a compassionate education service look like? And you'll see, although it's not a faith-based organisation, it's non-religious, and there are Muslims on it, but there are also other groups. It's a secular organisation, but you'll see how the love of Allah fits into all that. And how Islam really is one of the central drivers to me is, and I say this when I'm working with young people, how many times does the Rahman appear? I think it's about 114 times in the Quran. The most beneficent, the most compassionate. And yet, with so many of our Muslim brothers and sisters, they seem to have forgotten the meaning of the word compassion. And so this is where I'm so privileged by Allah, because it all fits, doesn't it? So you've got all this work I've done in other areas, and all the work I've done in Islam, and they all come together because there's a strong ethical and spiritual basis. So I don't know where it's going. I mean, I've at the moment, the only money has been mine, which is obviously running out. It's bound to be time expired. You only have one lump sum unless you live a number of incarnations, as it were. But I'm hoping in time that we'll have a number of projects, because I'm very interested in the power of narrative, very interested in graphic novels, all about compassion. And it's partly based, and there's now a worldwide movement based upon the Charter of Compassion, if you've ever come across it. A wonderful woman called Karen Armstrong, who's one of the greatest players in the world of interfaith, working with all the major faith traditions to say what's common to us all. And the commonality is do unto others as you would unto yourself. And in all the major faiths, that's the key ethic. And so and Dalai Lama and everybody is actually saying is, unless we actually adopt a compassionate attitude to the world and to the planet and to the sacred, our children and grandchildren are stuffed, really. And so with whatever years I've got left, that's what I'll do. And then when I'm very lucky, because Allah's given me a good engine, as it were, and when he says, "Oh, you've done all right, son, you can stop now," then thank you, God.